The first time Lewis Quinn said goodbye to Lavinia Underwood, she had believed him when he said he was not coming back. It was the spring of 1873, in the dusty, wind-scoured town of Caldwell, Kansas, a place that sat at the edge of civilization like a man perched on the rim of a well, half deciding whether to fall in. The cattle trails had carved the earth into ribbons of packed brown dirt, and the smell of livestock and leather and wood smoke hung over everything like a low and permanent cloud. Caldwell was not a pretty town. It was not a gentle town. But it was alive in the way that only frontier towns could be alive, loud and desperate, and full of people who had come from somewhere else, and were not entirely sure they had made the right choice in coming. Lavinia Underwood had come from Cincinnati, Ohio, with her father, Reverend Thomas Underwood, who had been called, or so he firmly believed, by divine providence to bring a church and a school to the frontier. He was a tall, lean man with a gray beard and earnest eyes, and he had arrived in Caldwell with a wagon load of books, a crate of Bibles, and his only daughter, who was 22 years old and entirely capable of forming her own opinions about divine providence and what it required of her. Lavinia was not what the men of Caldwell expected when the Reverend's wagon rolled in. They had expected something meek and church-like, something that went along with Bibles and sermons. What they got instead was a young woman with dark chestnut hair that she kept in a practical braid, steady gray eyes that missed nothing, and a posture that said she had been told the world was a dangerous place and had decided to take that as a challenge rather than a warning. She helped her father unload those crates without being asked. She negotiated their lodging with the proprietor of the boarding house, a stout woman named Mrs. Etta Crane, and secured them 2 rooms at a price that made Mrs. Crane blink twice before agreeing. She was, in short, entirely herself, and the town of Caldwell took a little while to know what to do with that. Lewis Quinn had ridden into Caldwell 3 days before Lavinia arrived, which meant he had the marginal advantage of already knowing where things were. He was 26, with the build of someone who had spent the better part of his adult life on horseback, lean through the hips, broad through the shoulders, with hands that were rope-calloused and sun-darkened. He had dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that needed shaving, and he wore a gray felt hat that had seen better decades. He was not a gunfighter, not an outlaw, not a lawman. He was a trail hand, which meant he moved cattle from one place to another for wages that were barely sufficient and a freedom that was, depending on the day and the weather, either exhilarating or miserable. He had grown up in Missouri, the son of a farmer who had worked himself to exhaustion on a patch of land that never quite gave back what was put into it. When Lewis was 17, his father had died in the middle of a field with his boots on, which had seemed to Lewis like the saddest possible ending for a man, to work so hard that the work finally just consumed you whole. He had left Missouri the following spring and had not settled anywhere for long since. That was 9 years ago, and in those 9 years he had drifted through Texas and New Mexico and Indian Territory and now Kansas, following the cattle and the wages and the vague, restless feeling that the right place was always just a little further west. He met Lavinia on a Tuesday afternoon, 4 days after she arrived, in the general store run by a man named Harmon Bickle, who sold everything from flour to cartridges and managed to make both seem equally essential to survival. Lewis was buying tobacco and a new pair of work gloves. Lavinia was buying ink, writing paper, and a set of chalk for the school her father was setting up in the back of the church. They reached for the last bottle of ink at the same time, and their hands nearly touched over the counter, and they both stepped back and apologized at the same moment, which made them both stop and almost smile. "You take it," Lewis said. "I can manage without." "I need it for the school," she said. "The children will need it." Then she paused because she had not intended to explain herself, but something about the directness of his gaze made her want to be clear. "I am not taking it from you lightly." "I can see that," he said, and his voice was low and unhurried, and there was no mockery in it, which she had half expected because that was what young men in new towns often offered when they had nothing more useful to give. "You are with the Reverend, the man setting up the school." "He is my father," she said. "I am Lavinia Underwood." "Lewis Quinn," he said, and touched his hat brim, and somehow the gesture was genuine rather than performative, which was rarer than it should have been. They did not speak long that day. He paid for his gloves, she paid for her paper and ink, and they walked out of Harmon Bickle's store into the bright Kansas afternoon and went in separate directions. But something had been started, the way a fire starts, not with a roar but with a small, specific catch of heat that matters more than it looks like it does. They saw each other again at the church service that Sunday, where Reverend Underwood preached to a congregation of perhaps 30 souls, most of them there out of curiosity as much as faith. Lewis sat in the back, which was where the trail hands always sat, close to the door in case the sermon ran long and the horses got restless. He had not intended to stay for the whole service, but Lavinia was sitting at the small organ her father had managed to have freighted out from Kansas City, and when she played, the music filled the rough-timbered church with something that did not belong to the dust or the heat or the weariness of the place, something clean and unhurried and real. He stayed. After the service, she found him standing outside with his hat in his hands, squinting out at the main street of Caldwell as though he were trying to make sense of it. "You stayed for the whole service," she said. "I did," he agreed. "Did you find it useful?" He considered this with what she was beginning to understand was his characteristic seriousness. "The music was useful," he said. "I'm not sure about the rest of it." She laughed, which surprised both of them. "My father would be troubled to hear that," she said. "Your father is a good man," Lewis said. "I could see that, but I have been in places where good sermons didn't change much about how hard the winter was, or how far the water was, or how little a man got paid for a season's work. I think sometimes the music is the part that actually helps." She looked at him for a moment with those steady gray eyes. "That may be the most honest thing anyone has said to me since I arrived in Kansas," she said. He put his hat back on. "I am generally honest," he said, "sometimes to my own disadvantage." That was how it began, honestly and a little awkwardly, and with the particular brightness of two people who had just recognized something in each other that they had not expected to find. Through April and into May, Lewis Quinn found reasons to be in Caldwell more often than his work strictly required. The trail drive he was with had stopped outside of town, while the trail boss negotiated prices with the buyers up from Texas, and there were days of waiting that he spent with decreasing interest in the usual entertainments of trail hands and an increasing interest in helping the Reverend and Lavinia build their school. He was good with his hands. He could frame a wall, hang a door, set a window, and the Reverend needed that help. He accepted Lewis's assistance with grateful, uncomplicated warmth, which Lewis found touching in a man of God who had every reason to be suspicious of drifting trail hands. But it was the time with Lavinia that pulled at him. She was unlike anyone he had known. She had read more books than he had owned in his entire life, and she talked about them as though the ideas in them were practical things, tools for navigating the actual world. She had opinions about water rights and land policy, and the treatment of the Plains tribes that were more considered than most politicians and more honest than most citizens. She could be sharp and she could be funny, and she could be quiet in a way that was not cold but simply serious, the way a person is quiet when they are thinking carefully about something that matters. He began to realize, somewhere around the middle of May, that he was in trouble of the most pleasurable and terrifying kind. She had begun to realize it too. She noticed the way he listened when she spoke, not waiting for a pause to insert his own voice, but actually listening, tracking the argument, forming a real response. She noticed how he was with the children who had started coming to the school, patient and straightforward and funny in a dry, understated way that made the older children laugh and the younger ones feel safe. She noticed that he was careful with things that were fragile, physical things and otherwise, and that he had the particular kind of gentleness that belongs to strong people who understand what strength can do if it is careless. One evening in late May, after the school day had ended and the Reverend had gone to visit a sick family at the edge of town, Lewis and Lavinia sat on the steps of the church in the long, golden light of the Kansas evening. The sky was enormous and layered in shades of amber and rose, the kind of sky that makes even cynical people think something larger than themselves might have an opinion about beauty. "Do you intend to stay?" she asked him. Her voice was careful, not quite neutral. He turned the brim of his hat in his hands, a habit she had come to recognize as the physical expression of his thinking. "The drive moves on in 2 weeks," he said. "That is not what I asked." He looked at her and the light was on his face, and she could see the conflict in him as clearly as if it were written out. "I don't know how to stay," he said. "I'm not sure I know how to be in one place and not feel like I am slowly stopping, like the world is going on without me." "The world goes on without you regardless," she said, and there was no cruelty in it, only the precise accuracy of someone who has thought about this. "The question is whether the piece of it you are standing in has something worth standing in." He was quiet for a long moment. The evening light shifted. A mockingbird was doing something complicated in the cottonwood tree at the edge of the churchyard. "It does," he said finally. "Here, with you, it does." She looked down at her hands, which were folded in her lap, and something moved across her face that she did not entirely control. "That is either a very good answer or the beginning of a very painful story," she said quietly. "Maybe both," he said. "Maybe both," she agreed. They did not kiss that evening. They sat in the fading light and talked about smaller things, about the school and the children and a difficult family at the north end of town, whose oldest boy kept throwing rocks at the windows. And the conversation was comfortable and warm and full of the particular ease of two people who have stopped pretending they are strangers. But when Lavinia went inside and Lewis walked back toward where his horse was stabled, they both understood that something had shifted, and that the shift was irreversible. The 2 weeks before the drive moved on were the best 2 weeks of Lewis Quinn's adult life, and also the hardest, because he could feel the clock running. He and Lavinia read together in the evenings when her father permitted it, which he did with a measured generosity that suggested he saw more than he let on, and trusted Lewis more than Lewis had expected to be trusted. They walked along the creek south of town on Sunday afternoons, and she showed him which plants the local settler women had told her were edible and which were medicinal, and he showed her how to read the weather from the clouds and the wind, and these exchanges felt like something more than information. They felt like the building of a shared language. He kissed her on a Thursday evening, 8 days before the drive was to leave. It was a quiet kiss, outside the church door, with the stars very bright overhead and the distant sound of piano music from the saloon 2 streets over. She kissed him back, and then she put her forehead briefly against his shoulder, and he held her for a moment with his arms careful and gentle, as though she were something he had been afraid he would never hold and was afraid to hold too tightly. "Lewis," she said into his shoulder. "I know," he said. "You're leaving. I know." She stepped back and looked at him squarely. She was not crying, but her eyes were bright in the darkness. "I am not asking you to stay. I would not ask a man to give up what he needs to be himself." "You would be a reason to stay," he said, "a very good one. A reason to stay that you resent later is no gift," she said. "If you come back, I want it to be because you want to come back, because you have made peace with what staying means." He looked at her for a long time. "Then I am going," he said, "but I am not going forever. That," she said carefully, "is something I will have to decide whether to believe." The morning the drive moved out, Lewis Quinn said goodbye to Lavinia Underwood for the first time. He stood at the edge of town with his horse already saddled and his bedroll tied, and she stood on the steps of the church, and they looked at each other across the sunlit distance between them. "I will write," he said. "I hope you do," she said. He touched his hat brim, and then he turned his horse and rode south, and she watched him go until the dust settled and there was nothing left to watch, and then she went inside and sat at the organ for a long time without playing anything. He did write. The letters came with irregular frequency. once from Abilene, once from the Red River Crossing, once from a place called Doan's Store in northern Texas, that seemed to exist for no purpose other than to be a last outpost before a very long emptiness. The letters were not flowery. They were exactly what she had come to expect of him: direct, thoughtful, honest, with a dry humor that she could hear in his actual voice as she read them. He described the landscape and the work, the boredom and the occasional moments of genuinely spectacular natural beauty, the complicated social world of a trail drive with its hierarchies and loyalties and petty conflicts. He asked about the school, the children, her father, Mrs. Etta Crane, who had apparently told him frankly when she met him that she did not trust men who were too good-looking. She wrote back, and her letters were longer, because she had more fixed surroundings to describe. She told him about the children, a serious boy named Frederick who had taken to mathematics like a revelation, a small girl named Daisy who cried every morning at being dropped off, and then refused to leave at the end of the day. She told him about the town, its frictions and its small kindnesses, the way the cattle economy shaped everything from the price of flour to the mood of the saloon on Saturday nights. She told him, once carefully, that she thought about him in the evenings when the light was a certain color. He arrived back in Caldwell in the last days of October 1873, thinner than when he had left, with a horse that needed a rest and a face that showed the 6 months of sun and wind and hard work. She saw him from the school window, and for a moment could not make herself move. Then she walked out and down the steps and into the street, and he swung down from his horse, and they stood a foot apart looking at each other. "You came back," she said. "I said I would. I know you said it, I just wasn't certain." He reached out and very briefly touched her face with the back of his fingers, a gesture so careful and specific that it made her heart do something she had no suitable words for. "I thought about you," he said, "every single day." "I thought about you too," she said, "every single day." They stood in the October sunlight, the street moving around them, and for a moment Caldwell, Kansas, in the year 1873, was the most beautiful place on earth. The winter that followed was the fullest season of Lewis Quinn's life. He took on work at a nearby ranch owned by a man named Denton Hale, a practical, fair-minded man who needed a good hand who could also do carpentry and simple blacksmithing, which Lewis could. The work was steady and the pay was regular, and for the first time in his adult life, Lewis Quinn had a reason to be glad at the end of a day rather than simply tired. He ate Sunday dinners at the Reverend's table. He helped finish the schoolhouse with proper glass windows before the worst of the cold came. He learned that Lavinia had a temper that was controlled by intelligence rather than suppressed entirely, which meant it appeared rarely, but when it did, it was remarkably precise and clear-eyed and almost impossible to argue with. He fell in love with her completely during that winter without fanfare, the way a river fills, gradually, and then all at once, and then it is simply full, and that is what it is. He believed she felt the same, and he was right. She loved him with the particular intensity of a woman who does not give her heart carelessly, who has examined the thing she feels from every angle and determined that it is real and not a convenient story she is telling herself. She loved his honesty and his patience and his humor. She loved the way he was with her father, respectful without being sycophantic, genuinely fond of the old man, and genuinely interested in his ideas. She loved that he was not afraid of her intelligence and not diminished by it. She loved that he was not perfect, that he was stubborn when he thought he was right, that he sometimes went quiet and distant when something was troubling him, that he had a complicated relationship with the idea of permanence that he was working through day by day, because the imperfections were part of the real person, and it was the real person she loved. By February of 1874, the Reverend had made clear, in his gentle, oblique way, that he was aware of the situation and had no objection to it, which was the frontier equivalent of a formal blessing. And then in March, a letter arrived. It came from Missouri, from a man named Calvin Briggs, who had been Lewis's father's closest friend. Calvin was old now and had spent the winter ill, and the letter was written in a shaking hand that made Lewis feel the weight of time in his chest. Calvin wrote that Lewis's younger brother, Daniel, who was 19, had gotten himself into serious trouble, debt trouble, the kind that in 1874 in certain parts of Missouri had a way of becoming physical trouble if it was not resolved. Calvin could not help. He was too old and too sick. Daniel had nowhere to turn. Lewis sat with that letter for 2 days. He did not tell Lavinia immediately, which was a mistake, and he knew it was a mistake even as he made it. On the 3rd day he told her, and she listened without interrupting, her gray eyes moving from the letter to his face and back. "You have to go," she said when he finished. "I know," he said. "Daniel is your brother. He is 19. Of course you have to go." "I do not know how long it will take," he said. "It could be weeks, it could be longer." She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her working through the arithmetic of it, the distance, the uncertainty, the danger that debt trouble in Missouri could involve. "You will come back?" she asked. And this time the question was different from what it had been the previous year. It was not a test. It was a genuine need to know. "I will come back," he said. "I swear it, Lavinia. This is not me leaving. This is me going to help my brother and coming back." She nodded slowly. "Then go," she said. "Go and help him and come back." He put both his hands around hers on the kitchen table. "I love you," he said. It was the first time he had said it, and the plainness of it, the lack of preamble or ceremony, was entirely consistent with everything else about him. "I want you to know that before I go." She looked at him with steady eyes that were not entirely steady. "I love you too," she said. "Go bring your brother home." That was the second goodbye. He rode east in the first week of March, 1874, into the gray Missouri winter, with the intention of resolving Daniel's situation and returning to Kansas before the spring was gone. What he found when he arrived was more complicated than a letter could have conveyed. Daniel was a good-hearted, somewhat reckless young man who had borrowed money from a man named Cole Tanner, a lender in the nearest town who operated at the edge of what was legal and well past the edge of what was decent. The debt had grown through interest that was punitive by any measure, and Tanner had associates who were the kind of men who made sure debts were not forgotten. Lewis dealt with it. He worked for 6 weeks at a neighboring farm, negotiated with Tanner with the particular patient precision that was his particular gift, and eventually reached an arrangement that cleared the debt. He also sat Daniel down for a conversation that Daniel would later describe as the most uncomfortable and useful hour of his life. He arranged for Daniel to come west with him, because Missouri was clearly not the place for Daniel right now, and because Lewis thought Kansas might do for his brother what it had done for him. It was May before he could leave, and the road back took another 10 days. And when he finally rode into Caldwell on a warm afternoon in late May with Daniel Quinn behind him on a second horse, he had been gone for nearly 3 months. Lavinia was in the school when he arrived. He knew because the sound of her voice reading aloud to the children came through the open window, clear and warm and familiar. He stood outside for a moment just listening to it, and beside him Daniel, who had heard quite a bit about Lavinia Underwood in the past 3 months, looked at his brother's face and kept wisely quiet. She came out of the school and saw him, and there was a moment, just a moment, where something moved across her face that was not happiness. That was the accumulated weight of 3 months of worry and waiting and not knowing, and then it resolved into something that was happiness, deep and genuine and slightly exasperated. "You took 3 months," she said. "It was complicated," he said. "You could have written more. I know, I am sorry." She looked at Daniel, who was attempting to appear inconspicuous on his horse and failing. "This is your brother. This is Daniel. He is going to need work and somewhere to live, and he is very sorry for the trouble he caused." Daniel removed his hat. "Extremely sorry," he said. Lavinia looked at him with her gray eyes for a moment and then, apparently deciding he was telling the truth, nodded. "Mrs. Crane has a room. And Denton Hale was asking just last week if your brother might come back. I expect he will take on one more hand." That was the second return, and it was different from the first because it had weight to it. The weight of what it had cost both of them for him to go and come back again, and the weight of what they both understood they were building. The summer of 1874 was long and warm and full of the specific pleasures of two people who have survived separation and chosen each other again. Daniel Quinn turned out to be a better ranch hand than anyone had expected, including himself, and took to the work with an enthusiasm that Denton Hale described as exhausting and appreciated. The Reverend Thomas Underwood, who had added 2 more grades to his school and was now teaching 31 children, occasionally looked at Lewis and Lavinia with the patient expression of a man who was waiting for a young couple to do the inevitable thing. Lewis was planning to do the inevitable thing. He had been thinking about it seriously since March, and in the way that he did everything serious, he had thought about it carefully and thoroughly and from several angles. He had a small amount of money saved. He had learned over the winter from Denton Hale and from talking to other men in the area that there was still land to be claimed further west along the Kaskaskia River, land that could be settled and worked. He had begun to understand with some surprise that the restlessness that had driven him west for 9 years was not a permanent condition, but a symptom of not having found what he was looking for, and that he had found it, and that finding it had made the restlessness quiet. He asked Lavinia to marry him on an evening in late August in the churchyard under the cottonwood trees. He did not have a ring, which he apologized for. She told him the ring was a secondary consideration. He told her that he had a plan, the land along the Kaskaskia, a real house, a real life, something that grew rather than moved. He told her that he loved her in the particular way that was specific to him, which was not with grand speeches but with complete and committed presence, and that he would do his best to be worthy of her every day for the rest of his life. She said yes, and then she said, "For the record, I would have said yes in March." "I know," he said. "I needed to have something to offer you." "You already had everything to offer me," she said. "But I understand why you needed to think otherwise, and I love you for it." They married in September of 1874 in the church that Lewis had helped frame and window. The Reverend married them himself, with a straight face and steady voice that only wavered once, and that was at the moment Lewis slipped the ring, which he had commissioned from a silversmith in Wichita, onto Lavinia's finger. It was a simple band with a small carved pattern, and she wore it for the rest of her life and never once took it off. Daniel was there, dressed in his best clothes, which were not very good clothes but were clean. Mrs. Etta Crane was there, and the children from the school were there, because Lavinia had decided that a school day spent at a wedding was more educational than a school day spent at desks, which the Reverend agreed with. Denton Hale and his wife came, and a number of the other ranchers and townspeople who had come to know Lewis over the past year and a half and had decided he was someone worth knowing. It was the best day Lewis Quinn could remember. They spent the first year of their marriage in Caldwell, because the land along the Kaskaskia was still being assessed, and because Lavinia was unwilling to leave the school until her father had found a replacement teacher, which he was actively pursuing. It was a year of ordinary domestic happiness that Lewis found, to his enormous relief, was the opposite of the slow stopping he had feared. Living with Lavinia was not constricting. It was expansive in ways he had not known to anticipate. Her mind was always moving, always finding new angles on things, and being in daily proximity to it made his own thinking sharper and more interesting. In the spring of 1875, 2 things happened. The Reverend found his replacement teacher, a young woman from Ohio named Hannah Marsh, who was earnest and well-prepared and could also play the organ reasonably well. And Lavinia told Lewis, on a quiet March evening, that she was expecting their first child. He sat very still when she told him, and she watched him with the slight anxiety of a woman who is not entirely sure how the news will land. Then he stood up and took her hands and looked at her with an expression that she would later tell him was the most unguarded she had ever seen on his face, joy so complete it had no armor on it. "A child," he said. "Our child," she said. In November, I think." He pulled her gently into his arms and held her, and for a long moment neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said. They moved to the land along the Chicaskia River that summer, Lewis and Lavinia and Daniel, who had decided his future was in Kansas, and was beginning to act on that decision with a purposefulness that had not characterized his Missouri years. The land was good, rich bottomland along the river, with a line of cottonwoods and an adequate supply of water even in a dry year. Lewis built the house himself with Daniel's help, and with occasional assistance from Denton Hale's son, who was 17 and enthusiastic and willing to learn. It was a solid, practical house with 2 rooms to begin with and space to add on, and Lavinia looked at it with the same quiet pleasure she had looked at the organ on her first Sunday in Caldwell, as something that was hers, that she had helped bring into being, that would hold music. Their son was born in November of 1875. They named him Thomas, for the Reverend, who rode out from Caldwell to meet his grandson with tears in his gray beard that he did not bother to conceal. Thomas Quinn was a large, healthy baby with Lewis's dark hair and Lavinia's precise, assessing eyes, and he announced himself to the world with a voice that suggested he had opinions about it already. Lewis held him in the first hour of his life and felt something he had no name for, a love that was different from what he felt for Lavinia, not less but differently shaped, with a weight and a responsibility in it that was both daunting and clarifying. The years that followed were full years. Lewis built the ranch up methodically: cattle, initially a small herd, then a larger one, and a kitchen garden that Lavinia maintained with the same organized intelligence she brought to everything. Daniel met and married a woman named Grace Aldrich in 1876, the daughter of a neighboring settler family, and built his own house a mile up the river, which was close enough for company and far enough for independence. Reverend Underwood retired from the pulpit in 1877, his health declining, and came to live with Lewis and Lavinia, which pleased everyone, including the Reverend, who spent his last years reading to his grandchildren and conducting what he called ongoing theological conversations with Lewis, which Lewis looked forward to with genuine enthusiasm. Lavinia had not stopped teaching. She had built a small school on their property for the children of the surrounding ranches and homesteads. There were 6 children within riding distance by 1876 and 10 by 1878, and she taught 3 mornings a week with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the education available to children on the frontier was often all they would get. She loved it in the particular way she had loved it from the beginning, not with sentimentality but with the practical satisfaction of work that mattered. In the fall of 1877, a second child arrived, a daughter this time, which they had half expected and fully hoped for. They named her Clara, and Clara Quinn turned out to be a force of nature in small form, possessing her mother's will and her father's stubbornness in a combination that made for a childhood that was eventful. She walked at 9 months, talked at 12, and had views about everything by 18 months. Lewis adored her with a delight that he made no effort to hide. It was in the spring of 1878 that the third goodbye happened. A dry period had settled over the southern Kansas plains. The Chicaskia was lower than Lewis had ever seen it by April, and the cattle were restless and the pasture was thin. There was water to the north, people said good water, in the territories along the Cimarron, and several of the ranchers in the area were talking about a temporary drive, moving their herds north for the summer and returning in the fall when the rains came back. Lewis was not easy about going. He sat with Lavinia at the kitchen table 3 evenings in a row, and each evening they went over the same territory, the necessity of the cattle, which were the primary income and could not be allowed to weaken and die in a dry year, the comparative risk of the drive versus staying, the people who would be with him, and whether he trusted them. Lavinia was not afraid for herself and the children. Daniel and Grace were a mile upriver. The Reverend, though frail, was there. Mrs. Denton Hale, who had become something close to a second mother to Lavinia, was nearby. She had a rifle and she knew how to use it because Lewis had taught her and she had taken to it with characteristic precision. But she did not want him to go. That was a separate thing from whether he should go, and she knew the difference, and so did he. "It is at most 4 months," he said on the third evening. "That is what you said when you went to Missouri," she said, without accusation, just accuracy. "It is a cattle drive," he said, "not a debt negotiation. The variables are simpler. The variables are weather and terrain and other men's decisions," she said, "none of which are simple." He reached across the table and took her hand. Thomas was asleep in the other room. Clara was asleep in her cradle near the fire. The Reverend had gone to bed early with a cough that had been lingering for weeks. The house was quiet and warm and entirely itself, and both of them could feel beneath the conversation the thing that neither of them said directly, that every goodbye was a risk, not because Lewis would choose not to come back, but because the world did not always arrange itself according to choice. "I will come back," he said. 4 months, before the first freeze." She looked at him. "I know you intend to," she said. "I know that is real. I am not questioning your intention." "What are you questioning?" She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was careful. "I am not questioning anything. I am telling you that it is hard, each time. Not because you are unreliable, you are not, but because 4 months is 4 months, and this house is full of things that need you, and I need you, and I am allowed to say that." "You are absolutely allowed to say that," he said. "And I hear it. I am not going because I want to be away from you. I am going because we need the cattle to survive the year, and the cattle need water." "I know," she said. And then, after a pause, "Kiss me good night, Lewis. We will talk more tomorrow." He kissed her good night, and it was the kind of kiss that had years in it. He left in the first week of May, 1878, with the cattle and 4 other men, including Denton Hale's eldest son, who was now 20 and had turned into a capable and reliable young man. The drive north was 4 days, and the summer camp along the Cimarron was organized and adequate. Lewis wrote letters when he could, and the letters arrived in Caldwell and were then brought out to the homestead by a neighborly writer, and Lavinia wrote back. And for the most part the summer passed in the long, quiet rhythm of a difficult season being endured. But in late July, something went wrong. It was not dramatic, which was the strange thing about it. There was a night storm, a significant one, with lightning that spooked the cattle, and in the course of containing the herd Lewis's horse fell in the dark on uneven ground. Lewis was thrown, and he landed badly, and by morning it was clear that his left arm was broken and possibly one rib as well. The break was not clean. Denton Hale's son, whose name was Robert, did what he could, which was to splint the arm and urge Lewis to ride back south to find a doctor. Lewis was not willing to leave the drive short-handed. They argued about it, and Lewis was stubborn in the way he was always stubborn when he thought he was right, and in the end he stayed for another 3 weeks while his arm healed imperfectly in its splint. When they finally returned south in late September, the arm was functional but not entirely right, and a doctor in Caldwell told him that it had healed with a slight misalignment that would likely cause stiffness in cold weather for the rest of his life. Lewis accepted this with the matter-of-fact equanimity that characterized his relationship with physical hardship. Lavinia did not accept it with equanimity. She accepted it with the particular quiet fury of a woman who has been worried for months, and then discovers the reason for the worry was real, and has been managed in the most stubbornly inadequate way possible. She cleaned and rewrapped the arm and listened to the doctor's assessment, and held herself together until the doctor left, and then she turned to Lewis with eyes that were bright with something that was partly anger and partly profound relief and partly grief for the months she had spent not knowing. "Your arm," she said. "It is fine," he said. "It works. It works imperfectly because you stayed on that drive for 3 weeks with a broken arm and a broken rib instead of riding south to a doctor. We were short-handed," he said. "Lewis." "I know," he said. "I know it was not the wisest decision. I am sorry." She looked at him for a long moment. "Are you in pain right now? Manageable pain?" "That is not a no." "It is not a no," he admitted. She sat down across from him and folded her hands on the table and looked at him with those gray eyes that had the quality. He had thought this many times over the years of being able to see through most of the stories people told themselves to the actual truth underneath. "I want you to listen to me," she said. "I am listening. You are a good man who takes responsibility seriously. I know that. I love that about you. But your arm, your body, your life, these are not only yours anymore. They are mine too. They belong to Thomas and Clara. You do not have the right to be reckless with them." He was quiet for a moment. "You are right," he said. "I am sorry." "Stop saying you are sorry and tell me you actually understand." "I understand," he said. "And I mean it. I understand." She looked at him, measuring. Then she stood up and came around the table and put her arms around him very carefully because of the arm, and he held her with his good arm, and they stood in the kitchen of the house he had built for her, and he felt the reality of what she had said settle into him, not as an indictment but as a clarification. He had a life. A real one with people in it who depended on him. That was not a constraint. It was a weight that he was grateful to carry. "3 times," Lavinia said quietly against his shoulder. "What?" "You have said goodbye to me 3 times now, and 3 times I have watched you ride away and not known what would happen." He was quiet. He understood what she was saying. "I am not asking you to never leave," she said. "That would not be reasonable. Life is not like that. There will always be things that require leaving. But I am asking you to be more careful. I am asking you to treat your life with the same care you treat everything else that matters." "I promise," he said. "I swear it to you, Lavinia." She stepped back and looked at his face. "Good," she said. "Now sit down before you fall down." The winter of 1878 passed in the warmth of the house and the specific intimacy of 2 people who have recently been reminded that the other person is not simply a given. Reverend Underwood's cough worsened through the cold months, and by February it was clear that he was not going to be well again. He was 68 and had worked hard all his life, and had brought a church and a school to the frontier of Kansas, and had watched his daughter build a life that was solid and real and full of love. And he seemed, in those last weeks, to be at peace with everything he had done. He died in March of 1879, quietly, in the room they had made for him, with Lavinia holding his hand and Lewis sitting on his other side and the 2 children asleep in the next room. He said before he went that he was glad he had come to Kansas. He said Lavinia was the best thing he had ever done. He said Lewis was a good man, and he had been glad to know him. He said the school was a good school, and he was glad they had built the windows before the winter. Lavinia grieved with the thoroughness and dignity that characterized everything she did. She wept and she was sad, and she also continued to live, because that was what her father had taught her, that grief and continuation were not contradictory. Lewis stayed close to her through those weeks with a steadiness that she depended on completely, and one morning about a month after the Reverend died, she told him that having him there, consistently and reliably and fully present, was the thing that had made it possible to get through it. "You were there," she said. "You stayed." "Of course I stayed," he said. "It matters," she said. "I want you to know it matters." "I know," he said, and he did know. He had been 32 years old in March of 1879, and he understood, with the clarity of a man who has moved through the world long enough to see patterns in it, that the most important thing he had ever done with his particular abilities and stubbornness and honesty was to choose this woman and stay chosen. In the summer of 1879, something happened that changed the shape of what was coming, and it began the way the best and worst things often begin, quietly and without announcement. A family arrived in the area, the Beaumont family, mother and father and 3 children, in a wagon that had seen better months. They settled on the east side of the Kaskaskia, on a quarter section of land that had been available, because the previous settler had given up after the dry summer of 1878. Franklin Beaumont was a taciturn man who had come from Arkansas with high hopes and inadequate preparation. His wife, Ada, was a capable woman who was doing her best to manage the gap between the hopes and the preparation. Their children, 2 boys and a girl, were between 5 and 12 years old. Lewis helped them settle. That was simply what he did, because they were neighbors and they needed help. He and Daniel spent 2 weekends helping Beaumont frame a more weatherproof cabin than the makeshift structure he had initially put up, and Lavinia and Grace brought food and helped Ada Beaumont work out a kitchen garden that would produce through the growing season. What happened over the course of that fall was that Franklin Beaumont turned out to be something other than what he appeared. Not dramatically. There was no single revelation, no crime or violence. What emerged gradually was a picture of a man who was deeply in debt in Arkansas and had left that debt behind by leaving, and whose debts had followed him in the form of a man named Vernon Stead, who arrived in November with 2 associates and a piece of paper that was technically legal and claimed the right to collect. The situation was not, strictly speaking, Lewis's problem. But the Beaumont children were enrolled in Lavinia's small school, and Ada Beaumont had become someone Lavinia considered a genuine friend, and Lewis Quinn had a long-established inability to look away from injustice when he was in a position to do something about it. He went to Caldwell and found the sheriff, a man named Archer Poole who was competent and straightforward, and brought the matter to him. The result was a conversation with Vernon Stead in which Poole made clear that whatever the paper said, the manner in which Stead and his associates proposed to enforce it was not going to be acceptable in his county. There was negotiation. Lewis and Daniel contributed, along with Denton Hale and 2 other ranchers who had come to value the community they were building along the Kaskaskia, a sum that allowed the Beaumonts to settle the debt at a reduced figure, with the understanding that they would repay the ranchers over the following 3 years, which they did. It was not heroism. It was community, which was a different thing and possibly more valuable. Lavinia watched how Lewis handled it, the patience and the clarity and the refusal to be either aggressive or passive, the ability to sit across a table from Vernon Stead and neither back down nor escalate. And she felt a love for him that had been growing for 6 years, and that showed no sign of stopping. The spring of 1880 brought warmth early and a good growing season, and also brought the news that the railroad was pushing further west, and that Caldwell was going to become a more significant cattle shipping point in the coming years. The town was growing. There were new businesses and new families, and there was also, inevitably, new friction between the old settlers and the new ones, between the cattle interests and the farming interests, between those who wanted the territory to grow faster and those who wanted it to grow more carefully. Lewis watched all of it with the watchfulness of someone who had been on the frontier long enough to understand how quickly a place could shift. He and Lavinia talked about it in the evenings, about what the growth would mean for the school, for the land, for the children growing up in it. Thomas was nearly 5 now and was beginning to ask the questions that 5-year-olds ask, which were the best kind of questions because they required real thinking to answer properly. Clara was almost 3 and was a bright and demanding presence who had recently discovered the word why and was deploying it with aggressive enthusiasm. One evening in June of 1880, sitting on the porch of their house in the long summer dusk, Lavinia said, "I want to build the school bigger." He looked at her. She had that look she got when she had been thinking about something for a while and had arrived at a conclusion. How big? There are 14 children now within a reasonable distance. There will be more. The families coming in, the Marstons, the Fellers, the Takahashi family who came in last month. She paused. I want a real schoolhouse, 2 rooms, one for the younger children, one for the older ones. I want to teach full days, not 3 mornings. All right, he said. She looked at him with slight surprise. Just all right. What else should it be? It is a good idea. It is actually a very good idea. And you have been building toward it for 6 years. Why would I argue with it? She smiled, and it was the particular smile she had for moments when he was exactly himself. I did not think you would argue. I suppose I expected at least a caveat. The caveat is that I need to know what help you need and what it will cost so I can plan accordingly, he said. That is not a caveat so much as a question, she laughed. I have already priced the lumber, she said. Of course you have. They built the schoolhouse that summer, and it was exactly what Lavinia had planned: 2 rooms, solid framing, good windows, a proper stove in each room for the cold months. It went up over 3 weekends with the labor of Lewis and Daniel and Robert Hale and Franklin Beaumont, who worked with the focused gratitude of a man who understood what had been done for his family and intended to repay it in every way available to him. On the day it was finished, Lavinia stood inside the larger room and looked at the afternoon light coming through the clean glass windows and the rows of benches and the blackboard that Lewis had mounted on the west wall, and she was entirely quiet for a long moment. "It is right," she said finally. "Yes," he agreed. He was leaning in the doorway watching her. She turned and looked at him. "You built this for me." "We built it together," he said. "But yes, for you." She crossed the room and put both hands on his chest and looked up at him with those gray eyes, and he put his arms around her, and they stood in the new schoolhouse in the summer afternoon, and it was one of the good moments, not dramatic, not exceptional, just completely real and full and right. The school opened in September of 1880 with 16 children enrolled. Lavinia hired a young woman named Jane Ellsworth to help with the younger children, and the thing she had been building since she arrived in Kansas 6 years ago was finally the size it needed to be. In the winter of 1880, Lewis turned 33 and Lavinia turned 29. Their children were healthy and growing. The ranch was doing well, the herd steady and the land good. Daniel and Grace had 2 children of their own now, a boy and a girl, and Sunday dinners at either Quinn household were loud and full. The community along the Chicaskia was something real and durable, not a dream of what the frontier might become, but an actual fact of what it had become, built by people who had chosen to stay and work and help each other. And it was in the winter of 1881 that the 4th goodbye almost happened. It began with the weather. The winter of 1880 to 1881 was one of the hardest in Kansas memory: cold that came early and stayed late, with snowfall that drifted to the height of the house walls and a sustained wind that made outdoor work brutal and sometimes impossible. The cattle needed constant attention. The creek froze, and water had to be hauled. There were days when Lewis was outside from first light until after dark, and came in so cold that Lavinia made him sit by the stove before she would let him do anything else. In February, the weather broke briefly, and during that break, a rider came from Caldwell with a message that had been waiting at the telegraph office. It was from Daniel's wife, Grace, who had been visiting her sister in Wichita for the winter due to her sister's illness. The message said that Grace was well but that her sister had taken a serious turn, and Grace did not know when she could return. It also said that Daniel, alone at his homestead a mile upriver, had been seen by the rider 3 days ago and had seemed unwell. Lewis went upriver the following morning to check on his brother and found Daniel with a fever that had been building for several days. There was no way to tell immediately what kind of fever it was, which was the frightening part. Lewis rode back to get Lavinia, who had more knowledge of illness and treatment than anyone else for miles around, and she came with her medicine chest and her calm hands and her practical intelligence. Daniel was sick for 3 weeks. It was not the worst fever they had seen. It broke decisively at the end of the 2nd week, and he began to recover, though slowly. But it was frightening in the particular way that illness on the frontier was frightening, because there was no hospital and the nearest doctor was in Caldwell, and the weather was still too dangerous for the road. Lavinia and Lewis took turns sitting with him, and during those 3 weeks the mile between the 2 houses might as well have been walked 100 times. During that time, Lewis had to manage both homesteads, his own cattle and Daniel's, the water and the feed and the structural maintenance that the cold required. He did it without complaint, but it was too much for one person and he knew it. Robert Hale came when he could, and Franklin Beaumont came twice. But there were days when Lewis was doing the work of two men in conditions that would have challenged a healthy man doing the work of one. One morning at the end of the second week of Daniel's fever, Lavinia found Lewis sitting at the kitchen table at 4 in the morning, not doing anything, just sitting, with the expression of a man who has reached the limit of what stubbornness can do and is trying to figure out what comes next. She sat down across from him and said nothing for a moment, just looked at him. "I am tired," he said. "I know," she said. "I can manage it. I just need—" He stopped. "You need to not be doing this alone," she said. "And you are not, Lewis. I am here. Daniel is improving. The children are fine." "I keep thinking about what happens if Daniel does not improve," he said. "If Grace cannot come back. If something else goes wrong. I keep running the possibilities and none of them are manageable by myself." "Then we manage them together," she said. "That is what we are. That is what this is." He looked at her across the table, and in the lamplight and the early morning quiet she could see how exhausted he was, not just physically, but the particular exhaustion of a person who has been carrying responsibility alone for too long and has just allowed himself to admit it. "I do not know how you are not frightened," he said, "of all of it, everything that could go wrong." "I am frightened sometimes," she said, "but fear and function are different things. You taught me that actually. Not in words, but in the way you are." He reached across the table, and she took his hand, and they sat together in the early morning, quiet, while the fire in the stove ticked and the wind moved outside and the children slept in the next room. It was, in its way, as intimate as anything that had passed between them. Two people in the middle of difficulty, not performing courage but actually having it together. Daniel recovered fully by the end of February. Grace returned from Wichita in March, anxious and grateful, and fell on Daniel with the particular intensity of a woman who has been far from home during a crisis and needs to see with her own eyes that everything is genuinely all right. Spring came. The weather softened. The cattle came through the winter better than Lewis had feared. And on a warm afternoon in April of 1881, Lewis Quinn was mending a section of fence along the east pasture when he heard something that he had not heard in years. A sound so incongruous in the Kansas afternoon that he stopped and stood very still, listening. It was a violin. Coming from the direction of the house, faint but clear, carried on the light spring air. He did not know anyone who played the violin. He walked back toward the house, puzzled, and found Lavinia sitting on the porch steps with Thomas at her feet and Clara in her lap, and a young man he did not recognize sitting on the fence nearby with a violin tucked under his chin, playing something that was neither classical nor folk but somewhere between, with a sweetness and a sadness that stopped Lewis at the edge of the yard. The young man saw him and lowered the bow. He was perhaps 20, with a thin face and careful eyes, and he was wearing clothes that were trail-worn and a hat that had lost its original shape long ago. "My husband," Lavinia said to the young man, rising carefully with Clara in her arms. "Lewis, this is Eli Marsh. He stopped an hour ago looking for water. He is going to Caldwell." Lewis looked at Eli Marsh with the natural assessment of a rancher who has learned over the years to read strangers quickly. What he read was uncomplicated, a young man traveling alone, not dangerous, not deceptive, genuinely in need of water and probably food. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. "Missouri," Eli said. "My family had a farm near Jefferson City. We lost it this winter. I am trying to find work." He said it without self-pity but not without difficulty, and Lewis understood immediately the particular embarrassment of a young man who has had to admit failure to a stranger. "We can give you a meal," Lewis said, "and there may be work. Are you any good with cattle?" Eli said he knew horses better than cattle but was willing to learn, which was the right answer, and over the meal, which Lavinia produced with the efficiency of a woman who can feed an unexpected guest without being thrown by it, they talked. Eli was 21, the son of a Missouri farmer who had lost the farm in exactly the way Lewis's own family had been at risk of losing debt and a bad season, and the unforgiving arithmetic of frontier farming. He had a sister in Caldwell, the Hannah Marsh who had replaced Lavinia as teacher at the church school. He was a musician, clearly, and a reader, and he had a dry, observational sense of humor that reminded Lewis a little of himself at 21. Lewis gave him 2 weeks of paid work, which turned into a month, which turned into a summer, by the end of which Eli Marsh had proven himself capable enough that Denton Hale took him on permanently. He had also, in the slow way of things on the frontier, become a regular presence at Sunday dinners, and had begun to look at Lavinia's new teaching assistant, Jane Ellsworth, with the particular careful attention of a young man who is not entirely sure what he is feeling, but suspects it is important. Lewis watched this development with private amusement and a recognition he shared with Lavinia over their evening conversations. "He is going to ask her," Lewis said one night in September. "I know," Lavinia said. "Jane is aware of it and is being perfectly patient about the fact that he has not managed it yet. It took me 6 months to ask you anything of consequence," Lewis said. "It took you 6 months and a cattle drive and a trip to Missouri and a winter building a school," she said. "I was working up to it." "You were terrified," she said cheerfully. "I was absolutely terrified," he agreed. Eli Marsh asked Jane Ellsworth to walk out with him in October and asked her father's permission in November. They were married the following June, in a ceremony at the church in Caldwell, and Lewis and Lavinia attended together with Thomas and Clara, and a sense of pleasurable completion, as though something that had begun on the day Eli appeared in their yard with his violin had arrived at the right conclusion. The years moved in the way that full years move, not slowly, not quickly, but steadily, each one distinct and memorable, each one building on the last. The ranch grew. The school grew. Daniel and Grace added a third child, a boy they named Thomas, which caused a small amount of confusion at family gatherings that everyone found funny after a while. In the summer of 1882, Lavinia told Lewis that she was expecting their third child. This time he received the news with the calm joy of a man who is not surprised by happiness anymore, who has come to expect it, not in the complacent way of someone who takes things for granted, but in the deep way of someone who has built the conditions for it carefully and trusts what he has built. "I hope it is a girl," Thomas said, when they told him. He was nearly 7, with his mother's precision and his father's dark hair, and he had developed an opinion about most things. "Clara is very loud. Another loud girl would be interesting." "Thank you for that assessment," Lavinia said. "What if it is a boy?" Clara demanded. She was 4 and had her mother's gray eyes at maximum intensity. "Then he will be a boy," Lewis said, "and we will love him exactly the same." The third child was born in January of 1883, during a snowstorm that arrived with impeccable timing. Lewis was present for the birth, as he had been for both previous ones, and Daniel and Grace were waiting in the other room, and when the baby announced himself, another boy with a voice that rivaled Clara's in volume, there was a general feeling of warmth and completeness that the snowstorm outside only intensified. They named him Samuel. Samuel Quinn entered the world with the particular energy of a third child, confident of his welcome, untroubled by the unfamiliarity of existence, already loud. Lewis held him in the January firelight and looked at his face, and then looked at Lavinia, who was exhausted and entirely herself, and he said something that he would say again many times over the years. "Look at what we have made." "We have made quite a lot," she said, which was accurate. In the winter evenings of 1883, Lewis Quinn sometimes sat on the porch of his house after the children were in bed, and the house was quiet, and he thought about the man he had been in 1873, the trail hand on a gray horse, moving through the world with no particular destination and no particular reason to stay anywhere. He thought about what that man had needed and had not been able to name, and how clearly he could now see what it had been. Not a place, but people. Not a destination, but roots the kind that grew slowly and held deep and made it possible to be a tree rather than a tumbleweed. He thought about the 3 goodbyes and what each of them had cost both of them, and what each of them had taught him. The first goodbye had been the hardest in one way. The first step away from the best thing that had ever happened to him, made because he had not yet understood how to be sure. The second goodbye had been necessary and had been made correctly, because it was for Daniel, and because Lavinia had been right that a reason to stay that you resent is no gift. The third goodbye had been the hardest in another way, because by then he had understood what he was leaving and had gone anyway, because the cattle needed water, and that was real and practical and required. But Lavinia had said there had been 3 goodbyes, that winter evening when he came back with a broken arm. And she had said it in a way that contained not an accusation, not a threat, but a weight, a reckoning, as though the count of goodbyes mattered in ways that went beyond the arithmetic. He understood, sitting on the porch in the quiet winter, that she had been right, that each goodbye had a cost that compounded, that the question was not whether he had come back he had each time, but what the leaving had done to the space between them, the space that required constant tending to remain what it was. He went inside and found her at the kitchen table with a lamp and a book, which was where she often was in the late evenings, the children asleep and the house quiet. She looked up when he came in. "Cold," she said. "Very," he agreed. He sat down across from her and she put the book down and looked at him, and there was between them the ease of people who have been talking to each other for 10 years and know the difference between silence that needs words and silence that does not. "I have been thinking," he said. "Tell me." "About the goodbyes," he said. "3 of them, you said 3. She looked at him quietly. "I do not want a 4th, he said. She waited. "I mean not in that way. Not in the way where I go and you watch me go and count the number of times and carry the weight of the not knowing. I have been thinking about what we built here and about what the leaving cost, even when the leaving was necessary. I want you to know, that I understand what you meant, that the count matters." She was quiet for a long moment. The lamp was steady between them, and the fire in the stove was warm, and the house was everything they had built together over 10 years. "I was not keeping score," she said finally. "When I said 3 times, I was not marking it against you." "I know," he said, "but you were telling me something true." "Yes," she said, "I was telling you something true." "What were you telling me?" She considered this. "That I love you. That loving you involves watching you leave and trusting you to come back, and that trust is not free. It costs something each time, and I give it willingly, but I wanted you to know that I give it, that it is not automatic, that every time you came back was a choice I had made before you came back to believe you would." He sat with that for a moment, and then he said, "That is the most honest thing you have ever said to me. I have said many honest things to you. This is the most," he said. She smiled, and it was the slow smile, the real one. "Lewis." "What?" "Come inside, it is cold." "I am inside," he said. "Come further inside," she said. "Stop sitting at the edge of the table like a man about to leave." He stood up and came around the table and sat beside her instead, close, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, careful as always of the arm that was stiff in the cold, the permanent small reminder of the 3rd goodbye and its consequences. "There will not be a 4th, he said. "Not that kind." "I know," she said. "I am staying." "I know that too," she said. "You have been staying. You have been staying since Thomas was born. You just needed to say it out loud." "Yes," he said. And then, because it was true and he wanted her to know it was true, "This is the best thing in my life. You and the children and this house and what we have built. I spent 9 years before I found you looking for something I could not name. I am not looking for it anymore." She was quiet against his shoulder. The fire ticked. The wind moved outside and did not matter. "I know," she said softly. "I know, Lewis." In the summer of 1884, Lewis Quinn was 37 years old and did not go on any cattle drives. He ran his own ranch, which was now a real operation, 40 head of cattle, a good horse herd, the best kitchen garden in the county, according to 3 separate women who said so publicly at the harvest social. He hired 2 hands in the busy seasons, Robert Hale, who had come to prefer working for Lewis than for his own father, and a young man named Pedro Salinas, who had come up from Texas with skills on horseback that Lewis had rarely seen equaled. The school had 22 students by fall. Lavinia and Jane Ellsworth ran it together, and they had recently written to the county board about formalizing it as a proper district school, which the board was considering, and which Lavinia intended to make happen through the particular combination of patience and relentlessness that characterized her best work. Thomas was 9 and was already doing arithmetic that impressed his mother and made Lewis quietly proud in the way of a man who did not finish his own schooling. Clara was 7 and had recently decided she wanted to learn to ride, which Lewis taught her with the patient thoroughness that he brought to all teaching, and she took to it immediately and with an authority that made the horse seem slightly surprised. Samuel was 1 and was working on walking, which he was approaching as a project that required maximum enthusiasm and minimum caution. Daniel and Grace had built a larger house. Eli and Jane Marsh had a daughter, 6 months old, who Eli played violin for every evening, which Jane said was either the most wonderful thing or the most exhausting thing depending on how tired she was. On a September evening in 1884, Lewis and Lavinia sat on the porch as they often did in the evening, in the chairs he had made for them the previous winter, watching the last of the September light go gold over the Chicaskia and the cottonwoods. The cattle were settled in the lower pasture. The children were inside, Thomas reading, Clara drawing something, Samuel asleep. The sound of the river was a constant, familiar quiet. "I have been thinking about something," Lavinia said. "Tell me." "The school, the county board. What about them?" "They are going to agree to the formalization," she said. "I believe they will by spring, and when they do they will want a proper teacher with a formal certification." "You have teaching experience that most certified teachers do not have," he said. "I know, but the certification is the credential they will require and I would like to have it. There is a program in Wichita, 6 weeks in the summer." He looked at her. 6 weeks in Wichita?" "Yes." "That is," he stopped. "Far," she said. "I know, it is far." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she recognized as his thinking face. Then something shifted in it, a particular quality of recognition that was also, she realized, humor, the deep, gentle kind. "You are telling me you are going to leave," he said. She looked at him. "I am telling you I may need to go to Wichita for 6 weeks next summer," she said, "for the certification." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, "I will manage the children. Daniel and Grace will help. Jane can manage the school for the 6 weeks." She stared at him. You are not going to argue about it." "No," he said. "Lewis." "What?" "You are not going to tell me it is too far or too long or—" "Of course not," he said. "You want the certification. The school needs the formalization. Those are real things that matter to you and to the school and to the children in it. Why would I argue with that?" She looked at him for a long moment with those gray eyes that could still, after 11 years, catch him completely off guard with their precision. "Because it would mean I was leaving," she said. He looked at her. And then slowly the significance of it arrived, the particular, perfect, circular symmetry of it, and he felt something that was partly comedy and partly something much deeper and more complete. "You would be leaving," he said, "for 6 weeks. For a very good reason." "Yes." "And you would come back," he said. "Of course I would come back," she said. "This is my home. You are my home. Where else would I go?" He looked at her, and the September light was on her face, and she was 33 years old, and her dark chestnut hair had silver in it at the temples now, and her gray eyes were exactly what they had always been. And he had loved her for 11 years with an intensity that had only grown larger and more specific with time. He thought about the first goodbye, and the second, and the third. He thought about what she had said on that winter evening, that every time you came back was a choice I had made before you came back, to believe you would. "You will come back," he said, and it was not a question and it was not a worry. It was simply the statement of what was true, the same way you state that the river will run east and the sun will set west. something that could be trusted completely because it was built on 11 years of choosing. "I will come back," she said. And then she understood. He could see it in her face the moment she understood what he had just done, what he had just given her. The same thing she had given him 3 times when he rode away, and she watched him go and held the weight of the not knowing and chose to believe anyway. He had done it back. He had held it and acknowledged it and given it to her without making it a grievance or a calculation. He had simply said, "I know you will come back, I believe it, go." She was quiet for a long moment looking at him. "That is," she started, and her voice was not entirely steady. "It is what you gave me," he said simply. 3 times. She reached over and took his hand, and they sat together on the porch as the September evening came on, the river running below them and the cottonwoods turning gold at their edges and the cattle at ease in the lower pasture, and the house behind them full of their children, and the land around them built up slowly and well over 11 years of work and intention, and 2 people who had chosen each other again and again, until the choosing had become something as natural and necessary as breathing. "We should get the children for supper," she said eventually, her hand still in his. "In a minute," he said. "In a minute," she agreed. The following summer, Lavinia went to Wichita for 6 weeks. She left on a June morning with a small trunk and her teaching materials and her usual precise preparation, and Lewis stood at the door of their house and watched her go. And it was the first time in their 11 years that he was the one watching instead of the one leaving. Thomas was at his side, solemn and 9, and Clara was at his other side, not solemn at all, waving vigorously at the wagon that was taking Lavinia to the road to Caldwell where she would pick up the stage. Samuel was on his hip, interested in the horses. "She will come back," Thomas said, with the confidence of a boy who has never had reason to doubt it. "She will," Lewis agreed. "She said she would bring us books," Clara said. "She will bring books," Lewis said. "She always brings books." They watched until the wagon was out of sight. The morning light was warm on the yard and the garden and the school building and the river below. Everything was exactly what it was, solid and real and built with care over many years, an accumulation of all the choosing that had brought them here. Lewis put his hand briefly on Thomas's head and shifted Samuel to his other hip and looked out at the land they had built together. She did come back. 6 weeks later, on an August afternoon, the wagon from Caldwell came along the road from the east, and Lewis was fixing the east fence with Pedro when he saw it, and he set down his tools and walked toward the house, and she stepped down from the wagon before it had fully stopped, which was not her usual caution, and she walked across the yard and into his arms and held on, and he held her, and neither of them said anything for a long moment because there was nothing that needed saying. "I passed," she said, against his shoulder. "Of course you did," he said, "top of the program. Of course you were." She stepped back and looked at him with those eyes, and there was in her face everything she had learned over the summer and everything she had missed and the particular joy of a person returning to exactly where they want to be. "You are all right," she said. It was not a question. "We are all right," he said. "The children are good. Daniel and Grace were excellent. The school is intact. Jane sends her congratulations in advance because she knew you would pass. Where are the children? Thomas has them in the school. He has been teaching them arithmetic." She laughed. "He is 9 years old." "He is your son," Lewis said. "He has been teaching arithmetic since he was 7. She took his hand and they walked to the school, and Thomas looked up from the blackboard. He was indeed doing arithmetic, and both Clara and Samuel were watching him with the docile attention of children who have been managed by an older sibling. And when he saw his mother, the 9-year-old dignity dropped away entirely, and he came across the room and hugged her with complete unself-consciousness. And Clara came behind him, and Samuel came behind Clara. And Lewis stood in the doorway of the school that his wife had built and watched his family reassemble itself around her return, with the ease and rightness of something that was always supposed to be this way. In the autumn of 1885, the county board formally recognized the Chicaskia River School as a district school and appointed Lavinia Quinn as its head teacher. the first formally certified head teacher in that district. She hired Jane Marsh as her full-time assistant and wrote the curriculum herself over the course of that winter, sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings with Lewis across from her, him reading or doing the ranch accounts, the two of them in the comfortable parallel quiet of people who have figured out how to share a life and a space. The letter of formal appointment from the county board arrived in November, and she read it at the table and then folded it and placed it in the cedar box where she kept important papers. And Lewis looked at her from across the table, and she looked at him, and she did not need to say anything, and he did not need to say anything, because they had been building toward this for 12 years and they both knew it. "Your father would have been glad," he said. She nodded once with a slight tightening of the jaw that was the particular expression she had when she was controlling emotion rather than suppressing it. "Yes," she said, "he would have been very glad." Daniel came over that evening with Grace and the children, and Eli and Jane Marsh came too, and Denton Hale and his wife. And there was a supper that was also a celebration, warm and loud, and full of the children running and the adults talking, and the particular pleasure of a gathering of people who have built something real together and are taking a moment to acknowledge it. Lewis sat at his end of the table and looked down at the whole length of it, the food, the lamps, the faces, and felt the completeness of it with a simplicity that he could not have felt at 26, that required everything he had been through to earn. The restlessness that had taken him from Missouri through Texas and New Mexico and Indian Territory and Kansas, the 9 years of looking for something he could not name, had brought him here, to this table, in this house, on this river. He would not have shortened the wandering if it had meant missing the arrival. Lavinia caught his eye from her end of the table, and her face asked the question that faces ask in long marriages, the silent, quick shorthand of two people who have talked so much and so well that they have developed a language beneath language. He smiled back, and his face answered, "Yes, this, exactly this." The years that followed were the years of ordinary, extraordinary happiness, the kind that does not announce itself but fills every available space with warmth and significance. Thomas grew into a serious, capable young man who had his mother's intelligence and his father's patience, and an interest in land management that led him, at 16, to begin reading everything he could find about the science of ranching. Clara grew into a young woman of formidable personality and complete self-possession, who knew exactly what she thought about most things, and said so with a clarity that made Lewis proud and occasionally reminded him, with pleasing precision, of her mother at 22. Samuel grew at the rate that youngest children grow, faster than anyone expected, apparently overnight, while everyone was looking elsewhere, and revealed himself to be funny and kind and less precise than his siblings but more instinctively social, the one who knew everyone's name and remembered what they had said the last time he saw them. In 1890, Lewis and Lavinia celebrated 15 years of marriage. They were 43 and 39 respectively, and the ranch was the largest on the Chicaskia River, and the school had 37 students and 2 full-time teachers, and had produced 3 young people who had gone on to college, which would not have seemed possible in 1873 when Lavinia had arrived in Caldwell with a crate of Bibles and a box of chalk. Thomas was 15 and already doing real work on the ranch, not as a chore but as a vocation. He had the rancher's eye that Lewis had developed over decades, the ability to look at land and weather and cattle and read what they needed, and he had additionally a facility with numbers that made the ranch accounts both more accurate and more interesting. Lewis watched him with a pleasure that was only partly paternal pride and mostly a genuine appreciation for a capable person learning to be excellent. One evening in the fall of 1890, Lewis and Lavinia walked along the Chicaskia in the way they had made a habit of doing in the autumn evenings, just walking in the cottonwood light, with the river low and clear beside them. They were past the easy conversational silences now into something richer, the silence of two people who have said the most important things so many times that the saying has been absorbed into the being, who communicate as much by walking beside each other as by anything that comes out in words. "Tell me something," Lavinia said, in the easy way she had of starting conversations. "What would you like to know?" "What you are thinking about," she said. "Right now." He walked for a moment. "About 1873, he said. "About riding into Caldwell and going to Harmon Bickle's store for gloves and tobacco. About reaching for the ink at the same time as you." She smiled. "That is a long time to think about a bottle of ink." "It is not the ink I was thinking about," he said. "What were you thinking about?" "That everything I have was set in motion by that moment," he said. "Every single thing, Thomas and Clara and Samuel, the house, the ranch, the school, all of it. If I had been in the store an hour earlier or an hour later, if you had sent your father in instead." "If you had not stayed for the music," she said. "I would have stayed for the music regardless," he said. "I have always stayed for things that were real and rare." She stopped walking and turned to look at him, there among the cottonwoods with the September light coming through in long gold angles. He stopped too and looked at her, this woman he had loved for 17 years, who was not the same as she had been at 22 and was better, and who he thought about every single day just as he had promised in 1874 when he came back from Missouri. "I love you," she said. It was, in the way she said it, both simple statement and full account of everything the phrase contained, the 3 goodbyes and the waiting and the trust, and the 11 years of mornings, and the children and the school, and the long, full accumulating years of their particular life. "I love you," he said back, and his voice had the same quality, the plainness and the complete depth, the word carrying everything that had been put into it over 17 years of daily meaning. She took his hand and they walked on along the river, and the cottonwood light moved on the water, and the evening came on gently, and their house was visible downstream with its windows lit, and the sound of their children's voices faint and warm in the dusk, and everything was as it should be. The 4th goodbye never came. Not that kind. Lewis Quinn stayed on the Chicaskia River for the rest of his life, growing older into his skin, the gray coming into his dark hair slowly, and then all at once in the way of all such things. The stiffness in his left arm a permanent winter companion, and not a significant impediment to anything. He became, over the years, one of those men who are the fixed point of a community, not famous, not powerful in any formal sense, but trusted and present and reliably himself. The man you went to when you needed someone who would listen carefully and speak honestly, and not pretend that hard things were simple. Lavinia ran the Chicaskia River School for 22 years. In that time she educated over 300 children. Some of them went on to other states and other lives. Some of them stayed and built the community further. All of them, when they were old enough to assess it, remembered her as the person who had taken their thinking seriously and shown them by example what it looked like to do a thing with complete honesty and complete commitment. Thomas Quinn took over the management of the ranch in his 20s and expanded it with the methodical intelligence that Lewis had passed to him, and found a wife, a woman named Ruth, from a family in Wichita who had the same quality of clear-eyed practicality that characterized the Quinn women generally, and brought her to live on the Chicaskia, and in due course presented Lewis and Lavinia with their first grandchild, a boy, and then a second and then a girl, which made Clara aunt, and which Clara accepted with the gracious authority of someone who has been waiting for this responsibility. Clara Quinn married at 23, a man named Joseph Vargas who had come north from Texas with the cattle trade, and had stayed because of Clara, which Lewis considered a perfectly adequate reason to stay anywhere. Clara ran a newspaper in Caldwell for a time, which suited her completely, and wrote about land rights and water policy, and the treatment of the Plains tribes with a directness and a rigor that her mother recognized and her father admired and various politicians found troublesome. They had 2 children. Clara did not stop working. Lewis had not expected her to. Samuel Quinn at 20 was still the most sociable person in the family, and at 22 He married a woman named Maria from a family that had come up from Mexico a generation ago and had built a cattle operation of their own in southern Kansas. Maria and Samuel were, by general agreement, the loudest and funniest people at any family gathering, and their 2 children inherited this quality and multiplied it. Daniel Quinn grew old beside his brother in the particular way of brothers who have been through things together, who understand each other without extensive conversation, because they share a grammar built from experience. Grace and Lavinia were, by the time both families were well established, something considerably closer than friends. 2 women who had built their lives on the same stretch of river, and in doing so had built something together that belonged to them both. On an evening in the fall of 1895, Lewis and Lavinia sat on the porch of their house, the same house he had built in the summer of 1875, expanded now with 2 additional rooms and a covered porch that went around 2 sides, and watched the cottonwoods go gold along the Kaskaskia. Lewis was 48 and Lavinia was 44, and they had been married for 21 years, and the river moved the same way it always had, and the light came at the same angle, and the sound of the ranch and the school and the distant voices of grandchildren was a familiar and beloved music. "I was thinking today," Lewis said, "about what you said once, about the goodbyes. When, years ago, in the kitchen, you said you had sent me away 3 times and each time it had cost something. And I said there would not be a 4th. She looked at him. "I remember. I kept that promise," he said. "You did," she said. "I want you to know that I know what that meant," he said. Not just the keeping, but the understanding underneath it, that staying was not a limitation, that it was the fullest version of what I could do. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the river. Then she said, "Do you know what I think about sometimes? Tell me. That first evening on the church steps, when you said that the music was the part that actually helped," he smiled. "I did say that. I thought," she said, "that here was a man who understood what was real and what was performance, who could tell the difference between the thing that helps and the thing that looks like it helps. And I thought that that was either very rare or the beginning of something very good." "Maybe both," he said. It was what she had said that evening 22 years ago. "Maybe both," she agreed, and her voice had the warmth of someone completing a circle they had not known they were drawing. The September light moved on the river. The cottonwoods held their gold a little longer, the way they did on the good evenings. The house behind them was full of years and lives and the particular density of meaning that accumulates in a place where important things have happened and important people have lived. Lewis Quinn reached over and took his wife's hand, and she took his, and they sat together on the porch of their house on the Kaskaskia River in the fall of 1895, and the 4th goodbye had never come, and would never come, and the thing they had built together stood solid and real and full in the long September light, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was exactly everything.